Do you want to use this?
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna stand here anyway because my notes are on there, so I can use either. I'll just use the arrows.
You sure?
Yeah. I might get confused between my arrows and those arrows, but we'll get there.
What was her name? From Cardiff.
Benedict's. Yeah.
B-I-C-K or
No. Yes. Probably not. I've got a PhD student who's doing stuff at the minute on safe space discourses within museums and especially around participatory projects. So it's really interesting.
I think there's a lot of really interesting things going on now.
Yeah.
That it seems like more and more people are moving from participation as a solution to participation as, kind of an area to study.
Yeah. Development studies has got a lot of stuff on. Yes, interesting. Yeah, thank you. No, not that. Later.
No, I was going to, for the first time, they went on long time. I was going to have one last week, and then I put it down, and somebody stepped like it. So I figured it was dangerous. And then I was smell like, really potent wine for the next few weeks. But actually, I don't really know what happened. I think somebody might have downed it and then just crushed the cup and left it.
Yeah, that's what spiked it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not like we got healthy supplies, so we could have just poured it early glass. But anyways, it happens. But we'll take you out after to the. We've got a couple minutes left. You can time for a glass of wine. Really get them to drink it up. So
Before it cooks. Yes.
Well, when we started in January, I think it's interesting tracing the time by these types of events. So we started with pitch black, and these mountains are getting wet, some sunlight.
Do you get them all here?
We do, but the focus changes so that it matches with
Yeah, I was speaking to you yesterday.
There's this master program first. Megan, did you find a bottle?
No, I don't have one.
We have one. Do you need one?
Do you? Oh, thanks. That's why there was so much white wine. In the autumn term, they do policy-oriented work. So the talks are a bit more about policy, and then because of the museums, audience stuff, we do the screens I was focused on those ones. So, and we have tried to, because it's a big time we've been slowly making the schedule a bit more tight, and I think that we're doing like 6 per channel, so that's the next year. And I know, you're the not the headliner, I guess, the closing liner. Well, maybe you're in which case it would be, thank you so much.
Yeah, no
One time I was at the event where there were 2 people there, and I was like, well, the worst, like, I don't believe it, it's like there's 2, the worst, I guess, would be there's just yeah, that's right. I know when you find out. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
We did in fact go forward.
It's still
Sorry.
Maybe just chop the front end off of I think we'll get cracking. Welcome to the final yours of 2016-2017. For those of you who are listening online, I think we're all set up, and if you want to ask questions or participate, you can tweet us at YOHRS, yours. Otherwise, welcome. I'm really excited to introduce you to Jenny Kidd from Cardiff University, whose work I've been admiring for a really long time, and she was telling me about some of the many projects that she's involved in right now, some of which we'll hear about today. Her background is in media and culture, cultural studies, and she still teaches on that at Cardiff, and has, I guess, gotten increasingly involved in the cultural sector with a specific focus on heritage and more in museums. And I think she will tell us about some of these projects she's been doing, which include app making, but also experiences on site. And also, she was telling me about her involvement in the Tower of London's Poppies exhibition, and maybe that will come up in the conversation too. So really pleased to have you here. Thank you so much, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. I feel I should add at this point that I don't make the apps myself. I watch people make the apps, and I don't plant the poppies myself. I watch other people plant the poppies. So yeah. Okay, yeah. So thank you ever so much for inviting me to be here. It's really exciting to be here in York. One of my favourite museums is the National Railway Museum, for reasons that I almost sometimes can't articulate. And I will be going there tomorrow for my annual visit to the National Railway Museum. Okay, so yeah, really excited to be here. I hadn't kind of realised that it was called the Yours Seminar Series. That's so nice. Yeah, okay, so yeah, it looks like you've been having a really great series of events over the past few weeks and months. I've been watching myself on Twitter and and following what's been happening, and I'm hoping that some of what I'll talk about today will kind of reflect and build on some of those sessions that you've had already. And I'll look forward to chatting with you more about your own interests and your own research projects and things like that, if you're going to be joining us in the pub afterwards as well. So I really look forward to that. So yeah, so you've heard a little bit about what it is that that I do. I find myself increasingly working in museum contexts and with museums and cultural institutions as partners on projects that I'm doing. Mostly that work is kind of looking at museums, cultural institutions and their work with the digital. But I also do a kind of a bit of activity around museums and their work with difficult and sensitive subject matters. So I'm one of the founding members of the Challenging History Network here in the UK. And so I'm really interested in, obviously, the points of intersection between those things as well. So how museums work with difficult and sensitive heritages in the digital environment as well. So those are kind of, you know, the rough areas that I'm working in. Recent collaborations include a project that I've got going on at the moment with the with National Museum Wales, Amgueddfa Cymru. We're working on a subtle mob. I won't say too much about that now, but if you want to ask a question about that at the end, then please do. That's about to launch. And I've also been doing some work and written recently about some work with Tate on digital ethics. Obviously, some of that feeds into what I'm going to be talking about today. And as has been said, I've also been working with the Tower of London and also now with the Imperial War Museum on the work with the Tower poppies. So that was not so much kind of the initial installation at the Tower, but some of the work that's gone on around that and the learning programs that have accompanied that work since 2014, because that, of course, is ongoing as the poppies now tour around the country. Have they been to York? They were at the Sculpture Park. Did you go and see them? Yeah. Okay. So in terms of my teaching, I teach across the Journalism, Media and Cultural Studies programmes in the School of Journalism, Media and Cultural Studies at Cardiff. I teach creative economy, digital culture, and a core module on representations. And I guess that kind of also picks up on some of the themes of ethics that I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm very much within that kind of journalism, media and cultural studies disciplinary framework, not so much within within museum studies or heritage studies. And I guess that kind of leads to an interesting disciplinary mix when it comes to the work that I do. So I guess I should put a caveat here that a lot of the work that I do, as I've kind of said, is with museums and with heritage sites. So that informs a lot of what I'm going to be talking about here. But I would love to know, in your eyes, how the issues around ethics that we're going to be talking about here refract in those other areas that you might be working in. So whether you're interested in archaeology or other different kinds of contexts, it would be really interesting to hear whether these ethical issues kind of ring true in those kinds of contexts as well. So I'm hoping we can have a chat about some of those themes later. Okay, so I have put Pokemon No here in the title in a kind of a nod, I guess, to Pokemon Go, which has been and continues to be. I found out the other day people are still playing Pokemon Go. I kind of thought maybe it had fallen off the radar a little bit, but they're still playing it. So for the last kind of 12, 18 months, you know, people have been talking about Pokemon Go. And one of the big discussions that was had about it was, you know, whether there were sites and particular kinds of contexts where the playing of this kind of a game might be deemed to be inappropriate or even disrespectful. And so you may remember that in July last year, there was a discussion about all of this within the international media outlets, and in particular, the playing of Pokemon Go at the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum in Poland. This was seen as being incredibly disrespectful. That was the word that the site themselves used, as they actually put a ban in place and said that they didn't want people to do it. So they actually banned visitors from playing Pokemon Go within that context. Similar stories, of course, emerged in other contexts at that time, including the Holocaust Museum in Washington, DC. So there's kind of, you know, this sense that, you know, there was something that was, you know, absolutely, you know, not okay about playing this kind of a game within that context. And we might think that that's entirely appropriate. And in fact, the bans were kind of quite widely accepted as being an appropriate response, actually, to this, you know, perceived problematic collision of our modern media landscape and our own uses of technology now with one of our most difficult and our most challenging heritages, of course. And it's quite a vivid example, I think, of how fully mediated now our experiences of course, the world and our encounters with heritage have often become. And I think a useful reminder of the ethical dimensions then also of that shift. And we might note that contemporary heritage moments often collapse, I think, a range of dichotomies. So, we talk about how the digital and the analog are kind of, collapsing in some kinds of ways in these contexts. Perhaps past and present ceasing to kind of, stand up in distinction in those kinds of contexts, open and closed, amateur and professional. And of course, also fact and fiction. We get this sense that within, especially the digital environment, those kinds of dichotomies are becoming, rather more difficult to hold up. And this, of course, renders them exciting but intensely challenging, of course, moments of meaning and moments of experience. And then to compound those challenges as well, and as is hinted at in the example of Pokémon Go, heritage site visitors also now inhabit a much broader media ecology, which makes possible, if not always encourages, practices of user creativity, participation, and remediation too. And that raises questions then, I think, about how visitation itself is being changed by access to digital media and the invitations to participate and to collaborate that they often then facilitate as well. So what I want to do here then is to highlight a range of ethical questions that I think that kind of, quite heterogeneous media environment now brings sharply into focus for heritage makers and for heritage professionals. And they include, and I'll talk more about, how I'm kind of understanding and unpacking these things, questions about institutional voice, about ownership, about data, and perhaps most crucially also questions about power as well, that I think are core then to those different developments. And I think what all of that does then is it points to a potential tension between the playfulness that is often increasingly a characteristic of our experiences within the kind of broader communications landscape and the principles that continue to be enshrined in global discourses about ethics, whether that's in the museum's context or elsewhere. And that collision between playfulness and principles, I think, actually has the potential to be, quite a productive one, although never inevitably so. And it forces us to recognize the myriad ways that the very definition, perhaps, of a museum or a heritage site and of communication within those contexts might need to be revisioned or, repackaged. And indeed, of course, our use of terms such as visitor is also becoming more problematic and more difficult. And so you'll note how I move, often quite clumsily and clunkily, between the terms visitor, user, audience. I try to find the best and most appropriate one for uses in different kinds of contexts. I'm not entirely sure I always get that right. I'm not entirely sure how that also plays out, say, in archaeology, whether there's a different kind of attention around terminologies there. It would be interesting to hear more about that. It's maybe something that we can talk about. But some of those terms, it seems to me, are becoming, again, much, used in much looser ways and much more difficult to define. However, we do define them, though. Heritage encounters are rarely for us now as visitors, users or audiences, I don't think, completely offline. We've always got our phones in our pockets, they're pinging away, we might want to look something up on Wikipedia or whatever else. So we're rarely completely offline when we're in these kinds of contexts, just as online visits, of course, are not disembodied. Instead, perhaps they're best conceived of as multifaceted and multimodal, all of those different kinds of encounters. So Jason Farnham, in this quote here on the board, notes that locating oneself simultaneously in digital space and in material space has become an everyday action for many people. And I think what we really need is a museology and a heritage studies that recognizes that without being alarmed by it. And I think sometimes, we're kind of alarmed by that realization. So we might note that museum ethics or heritage ethics has, of course, never been simple or straightforward. We have professional codes in place that, of course, offer us guidance and help us to kind of work our way through that landscape. They seek to support professionals as they acquire, steward, finance, display, and dispose of artifacts of cultural heritage. We have those in place. And they have, and you may well know this, been open to revision in recent years as part of a broader discussion about the evolving roles in society of museums and heritage sites. And so I was just having a little kind of browse around earlier online, and I noted that the Code of Ethics for Archaeologists has been revised in recent years. You may know that the Code of Ethics for Museums has also been revised in recent years in the UK, and also the International Council of Museums Code of Ethics also. So they've all been kind of subject to revision in recent years. Georgios Papayannou notes that ethics have acquired new dimensions in the 21st century, in part because of the advent now of new technologies or digital technologies, however we want to term them. These technologies introduce for us quite complex layers of ambiguity to many of those ethical questions that, we've had going on for, right through those years. And of course, they have then added numerous new things that we also need to consider as we think about ethics. But museums and heritage institutions work with the digital has not been immune to recent debates about ethics, and their consideration, however, has been rather limited. As we talk more about virtual and augmented reality, 3D printing, mobile applications, open data, linked data, and all of that, increasingly sophisticated content management systems, it's easy to forget, actually, I think, that for many people, and most institutions, simple opportunities to connect via social media or to blog or to post on video hosting sites are actually less than a decade old, for most people and for most institutions. I think we sometimes maybe, lose sight of that. So the platforms upon which these kinds of participatory digital media are made available to us are still evolving, and the terms upon which they operate are also mutating fast, and we kind of need to keep an eye on that. Gerard Goggin has proposed that rather than seeing these kinds of technologies, new technologies, digital technologies, as a given, a more productive way to think about them is as an open set of questions, and I quite like that approach. That's an approach that I would advocate. So then that leads us to think, what kinds of questions might we ask then? And I've begun tentatively, I think, suggesting that operating ethically within these kinds of environments is akin to a new kind of professional literacy, something that we need to think more about. And so what I want to do at this stage is just to kind of talk through how I see that kind of, panning out. So 4 themes that I think we maybe need to think a little bit more about, within this kind of idea of the new professional literacy. So I've got 4 themes and then some examples that I'm going to use in order to talk these through. So the 4 themes that I want to explore, or that I want to encourage us to explore as ways into this theme of digital heritage ethics or digital museum ethics, are user contributions and debates about how to value them, risk and its management, playing with the truth, and also power and its negotiation. So those are my 4 themes. They are not a comprehensive list. You may have other things that you think we need to be thinking about, and we can, of course, talk about those. But in particular, thinking about kind of participatory media landscapes and social media, I think these are some of the things that we might need to be thinking about more. So firstly then, valuing user contributions. So you will know that there have been debates right across the field of media and communications about how to best make use of and to understand the contributions of members of the public, or user-generated content, as those things were kind of collectively termed for a while at least. We don't tend to use that term so much anymore for all sorts of reasons. Broadcasters and news outlets, for example, have been engaged in, quite kind of long-term now and quite searching debates about the kind of value of these kinds of contributions. So, for example, comments on news stories or blogs that are open to comment. And actually what we have seen in recent years is some media organisations starting to retract some of those opportunities. So for the BBC, for example, you were able to comment on far fewer news stories than you might have been able to maybe 5 years ago. And that's in recognition of the kind of, huge amount of time and effort that goes into moderation in those kinds of spaces. But I think also in recognition that the kinds of debate and the kinds of discourse that are emerging within those kinds of spaces might also need some thinking about. And so they're kind of, closing down actually a lot of those opportunities now for comment and for debate. And these are, of course, debates that have been happening with museums and heritage institutions as well. So they also are trying to operate in increasingly sophisticated ways within social media sites and in the blogosphere. And they too are trying to think through some of these issues, as you will know. And these issues are not trivial because they do connect, of course, with issues of power, of representation, and of voice. So in recent years, we've seen websites of museums and heritage institutions become the hosts of, great archives of reflection and of memory. And their social media spaces serve as, a nexus for great outpourings of opinion and sometimes even, of course, also grief. And I think those activities raise all sorts of questions about what the responsibility of institutions might be within those kinds of spaces. So the responsibility perhaps to look after people's emotional welfare within those kinds of interactions. And there we might be talking about the public, members of the public, but also, of course, their own staff who are having to operate within those kinds of spaces as well. Indeed, also, what is their responsibility then to the content that is being created as a result of those kind of, calls to participate and to interact via social media? And I think we might want to ask the question, well, what is the value of that kind of intense subjectivity that museums are kind of courting in those kinds of spaces, especially in calls to remember, to share stories, to share photos, to share memories? We've all come across those kinds of invites, those opportunities in those kinds of spaces. And we might ask whether institutions and also then their followers are actually clear about why those contributions are being sought and what is going to happen to them once they are rendered content or even data further down the line. And what I wanted to talk a little bit about here was some of the Tower Poppies work. And so if you look at the Tower Poppies installation, and I'm sure you'll be familiar with it, the planting of those poppies in the moat, is a huge scale project, very, very visible project. And there was a very active Twitter hashtag that accompanied the project. So hashtag Tower Poppies, where people, still continue to post now as the poppies tour around the country. And so what we've seen with that is, tens of thousands of tweets, being posted on that hashtag, ranging, of course, from the critical, so people who wanted to be critical of the installation itself. So where are the white poppies? Where are the poppies that, commemorate those who fought, from the Commonwealth? So people who wanted to be critical of that installation, but also, of course, then people who wanted to share their own stories or stories of their ancestors, stories that were poignant, stories that were emotional. So the hashtag itself actually is a quite staggering archive of remembrance, but we might know a kind of an ephemeral one. And so we might think, okay, well, now in reflecting on that archive, who now owns it? Who has a responsibility for it? Should anyone have a responsibility for it? Is it the individuals who posted those tweets that actually own that content? Or is it a third party, perhaps Twitter? And those things are not clear. And so I was doing some investigation of this, and we might think, okay, individuals own their posts, but actually the courts have decided that Twitter owns a lot of those posts. Who can decide what the value of that archive might be? And what would be a fitting way of making sense of it, either now or maybe in the future? What might be the copyright entanglements if the Tower of London decide that they want to accession that hashtag into their own archive? Or if they want to use it in another format, you know, say, this is a bit of a crass example, but if they wanted to produce calendars or T-shirts or whatever else, you know, what happens in those kinds of situations? Claire Bailey-Ross, who you may know, she's a scholar working in this area, has blogged about the challenges of accessioning social media content. So these are real, you know, real questions that people are asking in the sector. What permissions would need to be sought if you wanted to accession this hashtag? Is it different for the text than for the images? And if so, why? What about privacy? You know, these are all questions that we might ask in that kind of example. And of course, we should also remind ourselves that the ethical responses to those kinds of questions might be rather more ambiguous than the legal ones. So the legal answers don't necessarily give us everything that we need in order to make decisions about what should happen to that kind of content. We might also note that museums' social media sites also often become the sites of quite intense memorialization. It continues to be the case that people turn to museums and their social media sites in moments of crisis and also in moments of tragedy. And so after the terrorist attacks in Paris in November 2015, people around the world went to the Facebook pages of the city's many well-known cultural institutions to express their grief and express their anger. And some of that content was, of course, expressly political in its tone. So again, we might ask, well, what might we make of that kind of activity? Without even eliciting it, without even asking for it, a site's digital presence can become a live space for personal testimony on themes that are expressly political. And how should staff then respond to those kinds of posts? You know, posts that might be full of hurt or might be full of hate. Is moderation appropriate and defensible within all of those contexts? What might be the limitations of moderation? People often talk about museums and heritage sites as safe spaces, as if they were objective, impartial, neutral, apolitical, and that kind of language should make heritage professionals uncomfortable and does need to be tackled, I think, where we find it. Moderation continues to be a big part of the debate about our uses of, especially social media. Yet that kind of role, we might note, often falls to more junior members of staff, and its parameters are, of course, pretty ambiguous. Who is looking after the moderators? Vetting comments, we might note, is, of course, an interpretive act and is itself a risky business. So lots and lots of questions we might ask there about how to kind of value and work with user responses. And that brings us then to that question about risk and its management as well. And here we can pick up on that theme of moderation, and we can begin to see how risk and, of course, reputation management become a part of the debate about what is ethical within these kinds of spaces. Moderation is perhaps at its most problematic when and where it verges on censorship, such as instances where public debate about an institution's corporate affairs takes place on social media. We've seen examples of this. We've had recent cases with the British Museum, with Tate, and with the Science Museum in the United Kingdom. You know, these institutions have been openly criticised on social media and in other outlets for their corporate ties. There are activist groups such as Big Oil Out of Culture and Liberate Tate, who have used themselves digital media in order to amplify their messaging on those themes as well. Where criticisms of institutions are voiced within participatory media spaces, institutions, of course, have to tread a very difficult line. To manage or to moderate all comments out of existence would be to censor debate within precisely those platforms where dialogue is being promoted and where it seems to be being encouraged. And of course, it does nothing for positive public relations where it's found out that that kind of censorship has been happening. But within the searchable talk, as it's been termed, of Twitter, diverse perspectives on a heritage or on an institution can come easily into commune, and that rightly makes us nervous. Perhaps less politically sensitive, but by no means inconsequential, is the increased complexity of copyright protections within the digital domain as well. And it's in this arena, I think, where the incongruence between legal positions and ethical positions is actually perhaps best clearly demonstrated. So institutions might legally own the copyright for, say, an artwork, for example, but it might still be considered ethically problematic for them to assert that users shouldn't download it, reuse it, mash it up, or otherwise distort it in reproduction, say, of an artwork or a photograph. And we might also think that it's ethically problematic for them to charge people to do that sort of thing, especially when those things are being held on behalf of people within national public collections as well. So there are ethical issues too associated with the commercial imperative and how it informs an institution's digital strategy, assuming they have one. And there's seemingly, and we see this quite a lot, a broad mistrust of the public to respect the integrity and the commercial sensitivity of works within online collections. Thinking about ownership and how it's frustrated within the online environment especially, I think raises further questions for those who might be interested in ethics. So who does bear responsibility in cases of misuse or non-accreditation? And what might constitute reasonable repercussions for those who do fall foul of the law? And that then, I think, fairly acutely also raises the question of what ethical responsibilities users or visitors themselves might reasonably be expected to uphold. So this image here, I think, exemplifies then some of those issues. It might be one that's familiar to you. It's a mashup of Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa, famously located at the Louvre in Paris, and the lyrics from American hip-hop artist Nicki Minaj's Super Bass. So the print was remixed by Fly Art Productions, and might be seen as a commentary also, a new derivative work that raises questions about art, about cultural value, and also about relevance. So here we begin to see examples of the myriad ways in which risk then needs to be negotiated within participatory media projects and platforms, and where the ethical and the legal also can diverge. So that then brings us on to the third of our themes, which is playing with the truth. And so a related concern in all of that, and again picking up on what we were just saying there and the image we were using, is a concern about whether and how fact and fiction are being demarcated within digital heritage work, and whether that distinction is always clear. We might or might not think that that distinction is an important one. Of course, it might be said that it's always been a frustrated relationship between fact and fiction when it comes to heritage institutions and museums, a realization that underpins projects like the Museum of Lies project here from Incidental, for example. But it is nonetheless still the case that members of the public value the truth claims that such institutions make. And they become, even more important, perhaps, in our current political landscape. As has been noted, digital media lend themselves to playfulness, such as in the acts of distortion that we looked at a minute ago. And it might not always be clear to users where mischief making has been taking place. So that begs the question then whether heritage institutions and heritage professionals have an ethical responsibility then always to tell the truth. Or perhaps we might think that it's time to ask instead if they have a moral responsibility to make the fictions and the distortions that have always been a part of the museological encounter more visible. And maybe that's something they can do more easily in the online environment. So that segues then into the issue of voice, I think, within participatory media initiatives. And what we do find in social media spaces, I would say probably Twitter especially, is institutions actually starting to embrace a kind of polyvocality. That is making space for multiple voices, multiple different perspectives, even from within an institution, not indicating a correct or a preferred interpretation, but leaving things rather more open and rather more ambiguous. But then we might think, well, how is that to be read then by and negotiated by members of the public? And so one example, I quite like this one, I've used it before, is an example from the National Media Museum in Bradford. And it's in the form of this series of tweets. So we have 2 tweets here that were released pretty much simultaneously that offer very different kinds of perspectives on the film Les Miserables. And so you'll be familiar, I'm sure, with the kind of on this day tweets and Facebook posts and things like that. It's, it's a thing, it happens. So here they are kind of taking advantage of that and the kind of searchable talk of Twitter that people might want to have a look at that in order to, to do something that's rather playful. So in the first there we have Hugh Jackman, star of the frankly risible Les Miserables, born on this day in 1968. And the second, as I say, kind of released pretty much simultaneously. Hugh Jackman, star of the utterly brilliant Les Mis, was born on this day in 1968. So released, as I say, kind of, pretty much simultaneously, those tweets in juxtaposition are doing something that's actually quite playful. Perhaps we think it's, a little bit mischievous, a conversation starter about a film that was itself pretty divisive. And we might think that kind of an example is pretty inconsequential, so what? But it does bring into sharp relief those debates about voice within social media spaces, especially. How should visitors distinguish between the different modes of address that they find in these kinds of spaces? The official and the authoritative, the playful, or the voices of other visitors as well, in retweets, for example. Does it matter if they can't? Is it always clear who is talking and who they speak for? So those kinds of questions, I think, are questions that have at their core issues about truth and interpretation, and they connect with debates about other values, such as, of course, public interest and also taste. They also bring us to this consideration then of power relations, I think, as well, which is a continuing preoccupation of much communications and media research and scholarship, and never more so than at the moment, of course. So on to then power and its negotiation, the last of our themes. So a lot of what I've been talking about here comes down to an invite, whether digitally or otherwise, to participate in some way. And participatory media undoubtedly have issues of power at their nexus. We know this. Indeed, according to Nico Carpentier, to talk about participation is to use a political ideological concept that is intrinsically linked to power. So digital projects, and again, you will know this if you've been involved in them, are very often articulated as having a radical potential for participation and for empowerment and for being a great leveler. But again, those kinds of claims, of course, need tackling, as does the kind of passive-active binary that they rely upon. Sonnet Takahisa has asserted that museums' participatory work needs to be taken to task as it masks imbalances of power and issues around control, authority, and access that need to be foregrounded. And these are not small matters, with the issue of access being at its core a real ethical one. We know that there are digital divides in place along lines of geography, age, socioeconomic status, disability, and ethnicity, and that real-world inequalities tend to be replicated in the online environment as well. And so if institutions are not careful, then it's those very people who they've been trying so hard in recent years to kind of court and to embrace as a part of, widening participation and diversity agendas. Those are exactly those people who they're going to alienate or they're going to exclude in these kinds of environments. And so we need to consider individual projects through a critical lens, asking questions about the kinds of dynamics of power that are evident in participatory media projects. Rhetoric, as I said, around this project often speaks about shared power, about collaboration, interaction, and democracy. But what kinds of democracy are heritage professionals talking about here? And are they committed to it? Who does it exclude? And are they okay with that? And the big hint is that it always excludes somebody. So it becomes increasingly important then that we think about how a call to participate is framed so that it speaks honestly to the kinds of experiences that we're hoping to architect in these kinds of projects and the kinds of outputs that we might be trying to elicit. So if a project is about securing new content for marketing purposes, then that's a very different end goal to sourcing new designs for an exhibition space or collecting additional metadata to support a collection. Making a digital story based on your own personal testimony is likely to make you as a contributor feel very different to another who is responding to an Instagram story. Also important, I think, is the right of reply that people have should they find contributing to those kinds of projects unsatisfying, chaotic, pointless, challenging, heartbreaking, or infuriating, which is not to say that, you know, museums and heritage sites have a responsibility to avoid all of those outcomes, but that, you know, we need to allow people to express them. So heritage professionals need to openly reflect on whether projects have been in any way exploitative or manipulative and how that might have been avoided. Otherwise, participants can feel a sense of continued exploitation that actually can become quite difficult to resolve over time. Allied to this are increasingly questions that need to be asked about the longer term use, archival, and disposal of audience data too. So a site's data policy, again assuming they have one, speaks to its understandings of power and how it circulates as well. Are heritage professionals clear about how they're going to use the data that they collect? For example, is there clarity about when and whether those signing up for use of public Wi-Fi are going to go on to receive marketing messages? How is their data being stored? How might it be disposed of further down the line and when, if at all? Are heritage professionals comfortable encouraging their audiences and their visitors to use proprietary platforms wherein their data is going to be sold to advertisers? Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Are they keeping abreast of wider debates about privacy and surveillance and public perceptions of those debates as well? And so in kind of reflecting on all of those themes, then we might begin to ask, well, you know, does this kind of amount to a need for a new professional literacy, a new skill set, perhaps for those who are going to go on and to work in these sectors? And I think in all of that, a crucial question remains for me, which is, well, where can those who are working at the sharp end of all of this, who are working on those projects, where can they go for guidance on all of that stuff when their professional codes of ethics are found wanting? You know, where are they supposed to go? It's clearly important that space is made for professional development in response to those kinds of challenges, but there might be concerns about how willing an institution is to support that kind of skills development, whether it's a priority for them or not. Perhaps it's the responsibility of those in this room and elsewhere who are training the next generation of heritage professionals, museum educators and archaeologists. Perhaps it becomes a part of the skill set that we learn in these kinds of environments. In the meantime, my suggestion would be actually to turn to these very platforms that have been problematized so far in this presentation. And what we find in those kinds of spaces in social media is an incredibly active community of practitioners who are debating many of these different issues in the blogosphere and in social media. So you may be well aware of these, but for example, hashtags like the MuseTech hashtag, Muse Social, Muse Digital, people from across the museums and heritage sectors are making daily use of those hashtags, and they are exploring exactly these kinds of questions. Moreover, those kinds of spaces have also become live sites for the negotiation of a broader set of debates about heritage ethics, if one looks hard enough. And I think this is really interesting. In recent years, and in response to a seeming lack of radical change within the profession, many insiders have begun campaigning online on issues that they think are important for the sector. And so we have movements like Museum Workers Speak, and also Museum Women, for example, that have sought to carve out space in the online environment for that kind of difficult questioning of heritage practice and of their ethical responsibilities in that regard as well. Museum Hour is another one that you may be familiar with. These are all worth taking a look at, because it seems to me this is where a lot of the debate is happening. And so whereas we kind of began this presentation by discussing people's anxieties about the contributions of audiences and how they might be understood and how they might be valued, where we end is with a consideration of the impact of heritage professionals themselves and their own contributions within those kinds of spaces, their contribution to the very face and the values of the profession itself. And so these are all some quite remarkable and profound debates, I think, and their longer term implications are, only beginning to crystallize. Finding answers to the multiple questions that have been raised here is, of course, not an easy thing. As with all ethical problems, there may be no clear distinction between right and wrong, and for some ethical dilemmas, there may only be undesirable outcomes, with a difficult decision to make about what course of action might be the more defensible one in the longer term. What is key, I think, is not answering all of those questions definitively, because the answers to those questions will differ depending on the context, and they will certainly change over time. But I think what is important is making ongoing attempts to explore them with care and with reflexivity. It's clear that making decisions about ethics has become actually a daily part of heritage professionals' digital practice, whether they recognize it as such or not. And I think going forward, considered appraisal of ethical issues should be identified as a legitimate, indeed perhaps a central literacy for those who are operating in and with the digital on a daily basis. And I think that kind of consideration should intersect with investment of time and, where necessary, also resource in looking at things like media literacy, data literacy, and also work towards data justice. So actively working against uses of data that might exploit or that might make inequalities worse. That seems to me to be, really important. So I think that those who are doing this kind of work need to be mindful, every day of two things. And these are that their entries into the digital or the participatory media space are not inconsequential. That's the first one. And the second one, then, that the technologies that underpin their practices are not neutral. Tech, platforms, softwares, hardwares are designed to influence behavior, and they were created by people with agendas and biases and prejudices and limited worldviews. And consideration of those issues, I think, might lead us to quite difficult discussions internally and externally to our organizations. And of course, these are also, questions that we're grappling with in the education sector as well. But I think these discussions are increasingly unavoidable. And as has been noted, they are already happening anyway. So this is a really exciting space, I think. It's quite a daunting one. There's a lot to think about, but it is incredibly exciting. And so I thought I would just end by popping up. Obviously, we can discuss your comments, questions, critiques, but these seem to me to be some questions that we might think about kind of, coming out of all of that. How are these debates, and I started by asking this, being refracted within your own research, study, or professional contexts? Are these questions actually, do you think, rather overblown actually, and a little bit cynical? And could we, do better to kind of take Mark Zuckerberg's, angle on these things and start thinking about ourselves as an online global community, as he was saying last week or the week before? Have museum and heritage professionals, who people apparently do still trust, got a responsibility actually to do this stuff right, or at least maybe righter than everybody else? And how do you think we can take these issues forward in a way that is productive and that doesn't lead us instead to a kind of professional paralysis, which I think is something that we need to, obviously steer clear of, but is sometimes a consequence of thinking too much about some of these things. So I shall leave it there and open up for comments and discussion. Thank you.
queries or responses to Jenny's question?
Thank you.
Hello.
Really enjoyed that.
Thank
It's
you.
So much to think about. And I was really pleased, and bear with me as I say this, but really pleased to see the Mark Zuckerberg quote at the end there, because I think that's a brilliant quote, because he's sort of so clearly invoking all of those early sort of utopian, idealistic, kind of anarchic ideas of what the web was supposed to be going to be, but at the same time is the sort of embodiment of the corporatization of that space. And so I think sort of, Facebook is a really problematic platform compared to the web as it used to be, possibly. And I was wondering, there's this sort of spectrum. Is there a way, I'll get to the point eventually, is there a way that we can sort of harness some of those more anarchic and open principles that the web is sort of founded on within our work, do you think, rather than resorting to the sort of easier parts of lockdown social media platforms?
Yeah, it's really difficult because you need to go where people are, and people are in Twitter and Instagram and Snapchat and Facebook, and we have these same discussions with our students. We don't want to go to Facebook and have discussions with them because we have problems, and we talk about it all the time in lectures and seminars as a really problematic example, and yet we have to go there if we want to have these discussions with students. We haven't found a way around that. There are all sorts of subversive uses, however, of the web and of Facebook and of Twitter and everything else. And it's how you get a kind of a degree of kind of critical mass around those kinds of projects or moments. Maybe to think of them as fleeting moments, and to not worry if they don't have the kind of longevity of Facebook as a platform, or the archival possibilities of Facebook as a platform over time. Might be to liberate ourselves a little bit, so to worry less about. But then how do you go to your boss and you say, well, don't worry about it, we're going to do this little thing over there, and it's going to take up some of my time, but it's and it might reach some people. That's a difficult sell. So yeah, I guess I don't know. It's I want to say something really positive, like let's all go over there, and has anyone else got any ideas? No.
That sounds nice.
I know. It's a bit interesting. Yeah.
No, thank you.
Tweet ideas. Yeah.
Is there a risk with like this kind of movement to kind of embracing social media and use of the web to kind of promote museums and heritage sites and to kind of get the public more involved, that you disenfranchise people who don't participate in this for either by choice or just because they simply don't have access?
Yeah, I mean absolutely a risk. That's that that risk about the digital divide, and it exists in all sorts of different kind of dimensions that we don't always have our we're not always able to grapple with. Maybe the it's not a wholesale kind of shift of what we're doing in heritage to those kinds of spaces. So I guess it's remembering that there are also people who are over here and have absolutely no interest in downloading your app, and why should we poke them all as they're entering and demand that they all download the app. Some people will have no interest in all of that. I've been kind of playing around with this notion of transmedia for thinking about heritage or museum visits in particular. So thinking about visitors as hunter-gatherers who will just kind of, grab the bits that they want and, and won't bother even focusing on the rest of it. So whether that's looking at, a book that they've bought in the shop, a Wikipedia page about a site, a TV program that they watched last week in preparation for coming. People will come with all sorts of different kinds of ways of connecting with the place and with the subject matter that's being explored, and those might or might not be digital, and it's unlikely that it would be wholly digital or wholly whatever on site. So yeah, that's quite exciting, but again, it's quite challenging. So how do you kind of prepare for all of those different kinds of visitors who might be coming with very different expectations about what happens, what they should experience on site. But I think for those people who do want to be able to, operate in these kinds of spaces, if you're putting barriers in their way, then that really, is problematic. One of those barriers might be something like you're doing stuff in spaces that they don't feel comfortable, entering, that they don't feel are for them. So it's that kind of reflexivity. Okay, what are we doing in this space? Who are we excluding? Are we okay with that? Maybe that's kind of, a mantra that we could be asking ourselves about, all of the projects that we do. Does that help?
Yes.
Yeah.
I wonder whether your third point there around trust and getting it right, and whether we could have put Trump fake news 16, 17, because this term has now been coined, and he uses Twitter obviously in a way no other politician ever has. And as a heritage institution or a museum or a heritage professional, if you engage in that space, do you become under the umbrella of what could be perceived as fake news? And is that okay? And then you play in that space and there are different rules? Or do you hold yourself apart and say, actually, the genuine opinion of this is it is fake news, and therefore we need to market ourselves? This separate idea doesn't run off over here and do something different. Again, I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah.
But to separate yourself in some way, it then comes down to what your ethics, what you're trying to get across. Integrity.
But I do wonder if we kind of push all of that away and say, well, that's not what we do, then you again kind of, set up the institution as this kind of authoritative source of information, that is in some way, the truth, or a better truth than other kinds of truth. And is that then problematic also? Yeah. I mean, it does seem that there is this kind of public trust in these kinds of institutions. So maybe to use them as spaces within which to have those kinds of debates might, not be a bad thing.
Change the image.
Yeah, and how productively are we having that discussion about what is fake news within the online environment or any other environment at the moment? I don't know. In my School of Journalism, Media and Cultural Studies, this is something that is obviously vexing people massively. So, yeah, it's it's a big old issue.
Just as a follow-up to that, I thought it was really interesting the way that the National Park Service in USA followed up to some of the Trump tweets on the issue of climate change, and I thought that was a really good example of, in a way, heritage professionals standing up for truth. Yeah. In a way, so I think there is some kind of hope there and integrity.
Yeah, and you're right.
I was interested that you say who people apparently still trust. I mean, that word's a little bit loaded. I just wondered where your data was behind that statement.
So well, I was looking around trying to find the data on, and so there is data that says that people do still trust museums, but it's a couple of years old. So can we still say that is the case? But that comes with all sorts of other things attached to it. So they really trust museums. And there is also data to say that because they trust museums as sources of, expertise and whatever else, they don't want them to do particular kinds of things. Like they don't want them to engage with heritages that are too political or too challenging, but because they see that as outside of what museums, legitimately should be doing. So there's all sorts of stuff that kind of sits around that we might think is, kind of problematic. And I think it was really interesting you were saying about the those tweets that have been sent out in response to Trump. I mean, museums, certainly in the UK, I think, and probably in the US as well, are kind of setting themselves up as much more kind of activist institutions and feeling more comfortable, some of them moving into that kind of space. So there's a really live discussion about how and under what circumstances museums should be being activist. But then that brings you back to those questions about voice. Okay, well, is the institution being activist, or is somebody within that institution being activist? And what does it mean for that person? And are they making themselves vulnerable? And can they, is it easy to distance them? Or that wasn't us, that was them, So, how you as an institution set up a kind of a permission for responding in those kinds of circumstances is a big question that needs to be, you know, asked by all institutions probably.
I have what is a complicated comment, so hopefully I can articulate it properly. You made a point, Tim, earlier about professionals having a responsibility to think about whether what they're doing is exploitative or manipulative, and maybe you could even go further and just say to think critically about what they're doing when they're applying different types of digital tools. So I'll use the example of social media. In my experience, when I've called out different museums, for instance, or individuals, called them out on forms of practice that I think are really naive or worse, very exploitative and manipulative, the response is often real defensiveness, which worries me around them being willfully naive about what they're doing. So that's one part of the question. So the other part is that in one of the activities that we do in the master's degree here in Cultural Heritage Management, some of whom students are here, and then some graduates of the program too, there's an exercise where they have to critique the social media applications of any heritage institution of their choice. And inevitably, every year, a series of participants in that project, like the students involved, will say, I don't understand why I have to do this. Like, I'm not interested in social media, and I don't feel I should have to do this task. And to me, this is all part of the willful naivete of the sector, because many of the students then go on to jobs where they are responsible for the social media feeds of their organization. And it seems like this really upsetting cycle where I don't know how you break it. Because almost every organization that I've worked with, big and small, has a social media feed, which usually they've set up because they're like, we've got to be on Facebook.
Yeah, so, everyone else is there.
Yeah, exactly. So it's inevitable that you'll go out and work in an organization where this is happening. And hence, I guess I don't know that I even have a question. I think I just am so in agreement with this point about it being part of a professional literacy. And I don't feel that anyone should have to justify why you need to know how social media works and the bigger consequences of using it. And I guess maybe my question is, how do you go about actually building it beyond having a series of principles that you might follow? Like, are there manuals out there? Like, what are the next steps, I suppose? Yeah,
okay. One of the things that I was going to say, but I don't think I did in the end, was that I see this as a part of, something that those people who are working with the digital every day should be thinking about and should be being trained to think about. But what I kind of was thinking I could have said was that actually, you can go beyond that and you can say that everybody should be. And you're right, at some stage, people will be responsible for Twitter feeds and, whatever else, whether they want to be or not. So I do think it's something that we should all be thinking about. And I was really intrigued, going back to the whole issue about the Museums Association Code of Ethics. There were lots of discussions and consultations that they had in the course of putting together the new Code of Ethics. And digital featured as a large part of those discussions. It was one of the themes they looked at in each of those consultations, and there were lots of discussions, like these. So it was very much on the radar. And I think what they maybe decided to do in the end, although I maybe need to have this conversation with them, was to subsume the digital into everything. And so to just kind of say, okay, well, across the board, we need to think, and to kind of say, well, we've moved beyond, we're post-digital, so we've moved beyond having to have a digital strategy, because it's become, a part and parcel of everything that we do. And in doing that, it becomes invisible again. So it's kind of too easy then to not take a responsibility for it and to say, okay, well, here's the bit, where we're all going to think about it and we're all going to ask questions and talk about the ethical implications and whatever else. So I think it's like the visibility within these kinds of environments and just saying, well, you do have to think about it. And, and we have the same problem with some of our students in the School of Journalism, Media and Cultural Studies, also saying, I don't really want to, be thinking about those kinds of spaces and what's going on there. That's not really where I would like to work. But the chances are that at some point it's going to be, on their horizon and something they do need to think about. And so we talk with them about, digital self-presentation and representation and whatever else, digital identity. And we also try and talk about things like, the fact that they might use Twitter in a particular kind of a way, but people who are, my age, who might be the people who are going to employ them, maybe use it in a different kind of a way. So they need to think about that when they're, having chats with their friends and sharing stuff from the Lab Bible and all that kind of stuff. That people read it in different kinds of ways, and that's a part of that literacy. So, thinking through what other people might, what make of their presentation within those kinds of spaces. So I think a part of it is making it very visible, and and saying to people, you will be doing this. It shouldn't be too much of a stretch to imagine that they will be, but I get it. It kind of is sometimes.
I was going to ask a question that I think links onto what you both saying. So I think my experience is that it's been that in smaller organisations, at least, digital activity and online and social media stuff can be treated as an additional, a sideline thing. And I was wondering, if in your experience, it's starting to move towards, and it sounds like it may be from the code of conduct you were saying about it being integral, and throughout. And I was thinking along the lines that having it as an additional means that often organisations aren't putting that much resource into it. That maybe your primary focus of your job is something else, like in my case, a list building caseworker, but I actually have to do a Facebook and a Twitter, alongside. But you don't get much support because it's just an additional. But actually, it sounds like you were saying there are problems with seeing it as throughout the whole as well, because then it becomes invisible that way too. So I was kind of wondering what's the best approach? Should it be that it's in everything, or is it an additional thing but we need to pay more attention to it?
Yeah, I think it probably depends on the organisation and where they're at. And I think that's, at the moment, it does sit very differently within different kinds of organisations. And in some organisations, it has become a part of everybody's, role. It's stated in their, job descriptions, and, they absolutely need to be thinking about it. So I think that's the approach now they have at National Museum Wales. And yet it is explicit. So it's something that, and in your PDRs and whatever else you're going to have to, kind of talk about. And then there are other institutions, where it's where Ross Parry has written quite a bit now about this idea of, post-digital and digital normativity within museums. And he's looked a lot at national museums and where they're at, and they might be seen to be, they're much bigger organisations. They might have, lots of different digital departments who are doing all sorts of different kinds of things. So the marketing team might have people in digital. The content management team will have people who are doing, digital stuff. Then there'll be people in education who might be doing, digital stuff. So it kind of, sits in pockets all around these institutions. But then for small organisations, it looks very, very different again. And it might be that it's just, being, it's something that's being kind of, given to one person to, take complete responsibility for, and what a responsibility, it is and can be. So I think it really varies by organisation. But I do think probably the how it should be also is that it should vary by, by organisation, and that we should be. There should be flexibility in how all of this pans out, whether you think you need a digital strategy or not, or a data policy. It might be that not all organisations feel that's, that's necessary. People are at different stages. So yeah, it's messy, but I don't know that it's going to get less messy anytime soon. Might it get more messy?
Sophia, did you have a... Yeah, thank you, by the way. I was just kind of thinking, it's really important to be able to engage critically with these platforms, obviously. But I think a danger of allowing it to be its own pillar is that digital media and social media especially, the longevity probably, if you put a lot of resources into your Facebook account, for example, or you have put resources in making a manual, as soon as you're finished with that, people aren't using Facebook as much anymore. It changes. No one, if you put a lot of effort into MySpace, and it'll change in the next 5 or 10 years, or maybe not. Who knows? But I think there's a danger in putting so much sort of resource into just one media account, or I don't know.
Although if you try to do everything, that's also, problematic.
It's not an answer.
Yeah,
it's
and
just kind of like a worry.
Yeah.
If you sort of
create all these rules for Facebook, and everybody agrees, okay. But by the time everybody's, agreed on it and it's written down and it's put down, then Facebook is irrelevant. That's kind of what I'm trying to grasp.
And you're talking there about, from the institutional perspective, that kind of resource that's going in, and it's with also kind of, reminding yourself that it's also the resource of all of those people who have, contributed the stuff and posted the photos and, museum selfies and all of the other stuff. There's an incredible amount of, resource and creativity and everything else there as well. And that kind of ephemerality is a feature of this landscape, and we can't assume that those platforms are going to be there forever, and that they will work as archives for our stuff also. So then that does raise real questions about, okay, well, what do we want to keep, and how do we keep it, and what questions do we need to ask if we want to set about keeping some of that stuff as well. So it's there's I think you're right, kind of putting it. Having said that, I was at the Museums and the Web conference last year in New Orleans, and one of the things that came through quite powerfully there, especially when they were talking about social media, was this idea that if you're just starting out, choose one thing and do it really, really well. And have somebody who's watching what's happening in that space, and respond to people, and rather than rush in and try and do something of everything.
Yeah. Although, just to follow on from that, I think the thing is that the platforms might disappear or change over time, but the underlying structures are still there, and almost all of these ones are owned by private organizations that are collecting your data. You don't know where the data is going. You don't know what it's being used for. And that's the bigger set of issues, I think. It doesn't matter whether it's Twitter or Facebook or MySpace or any of these. They're all premised upon the same thing. And if you're not, you're not critical about that business model, and you're not actually trained to start thinking critically about what's happening, as soon as you sit down and you're told you got to make a post for Facebook or whatever it might be, it means that you're participating in this, what I think is a really willful form of naivete with these types of tools, and you're buying into a system that actually we know has profound implications for democracy, for equality, and for the world at large. And I think that's the bigger issue. Doesn't matter if it's one or the other. It's they're all the same thing.
And then behind all of that sits Google.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Steve,
That makes the point that I want to make. Well, actually, which is many of these things that you're talking about, I wonder how much they've really got to do with the issue of the digital world, or whether they're problems with the world. And it seems to me that the issues are fundamentally about a system which can't predict where it's going. It needs to have access to the lives of many, many people to get their input into that. But its decision is not what they do about that, but if it can be made into a profit, they'll promote it. If it can't, they'll squash it. And for me, this was very nicely expressed, and why I don't have a problem with people going to Auschwitz with Pokémon on their phone. It was visiting Auschwitz, where there was a choice. You could either go on the regular tours, where you turned up on a bus with 50 people, you were ferried through a set thing with 50 people, and then you got on the bus again. Or you could take the local bus and go there and wander around, and took that option. And one of the things I found objectionable to that was that people were clearly making a huge amount of profit out of those set tours. And that, the point I want to make, I guess, follows from that. If you're someone running those tours who that economy is quite dependent on people, actually, as far as I can see, then the problem you face, I guess, unless you've got a system for telling every school that they must go there, which a lot of schools seem to want to do, unless you've got that regular turnover, how do you make people come back to Auschwitz for a second time? And I guess the answer to that is you need people like me who wander around and tell you what's interesting. So they do need the kind of lack of response to the structure, but at the same time, they need to implement it into a structure. And isn't that really what we're talking about here, ultimately? That therefore the contradictions lie in the nature of the unpredictable nature of the world, and the way in which even those who run it can't predict what's going on, but nonetheless seek to retain their power within it. So isn't that at the heart of and why you haven't got any solutions other than getting rid of this system that we live under, you know, and move to something different? That's
Yeah.
my small contribution.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, and yeah, not thinking about these as digital problems, I think is really quite important, and especially, and we were talking earlier about, you know, participatory projects, you know, quite broadly, never mind whether they're digital or not, and the kinds of questions that you might ask about them, and manipulation and exploitation and whatever else. Yeah, these are problems that you know, that we see right through heritage provision and its infrastructures, as you're saying. Yeah, I can't work out how I feel about the Pokemon Go thing. I noticed I didn't really give a perspective on it. And
I guess the people that were doing it weren't being willfully or intentionally disrespectful. And so in a way you have to kind of unpack some of what was going on in my mind. I mean, that's what I'm starting to think about is, you know, if you're wanting to embrace participation, then you can't kind of heavily impose your concept of what is respectful and what is disrespectful, perhaps.
And you also see this a bit with the kind of selfie shaming stuff that goes on, especially around, you know, museums and museum selfie and the way that people, you know, talk about that. Yeah, you know, it seems that, well, okay, here are people who are coming along and they're wanting to engage and they're wanting to be playful and, you know, in other kinds of contexts, not so much Auschwitz. Although it does happen, obviously, in Auschwitz, and that has been a, you know, feature of the discussion. Yeah, it's a kind of a shaming of people who want to do certain kinds of activity that we don't think are appropriate or legitimate within context, because we know how to perform our visitation in particular kinds of ways. So it does seem to me to be really problematic. I flip-flop. I can't quite work out how I feel about it. But yeah, that shaming is, I think, a feature of that landscape. And anyway, how we talk about younger people especially and their uses of digital media.
Is it a case, though, it's not necessarily the activity, such as being Pokemon or taking stuff, so more as the context of the site which people are taking as the reason that it's offensive? I work at the tower in town. Also has a dark past with the Jewish history, but it's so much further back through history that when people do show up there and they're playing Pokemon, nobody bats an eyelid. Yeah. But then they do it at Auschwitz and everybody's like outraged about it.
Yeah. Yeah, this is something that we talk a lot about in the Challenging History Network, about time and about the nature of particular heritages and the kind of permissions that all of those things, you know, put in play for different kinds of activity. Yeah, and so, yeah, I don't know. Again, I don't really know what the answer to that is, but I think those are a feature of that discussion.
So one of the things I wanted to throw in, since we're talking about Pokemon and all of that again, there was a previous game that all the data came from, and that game people could play at Auschwitz before. And one of the issues that came up with this was suddenly it became too big to ignore. People knew that this game had existed and that you could play it at Auschwitz and at problematic sites. But the sheer number of people became something that was, what I've been thinking of is like a clash of understanding of spaces, that there was a real idea that the digital space and these heritage spaces were separate and that they were not things that should come together. And suddenly you had this frank realization that these two spaces existed in the same place. And part of what I've been grappling with in my work when I look at ethics in games and heritage is trying to figure out how much of what we consider the digital space is actually just a different definition of space. How much of our lives actually takes place within a digital realm now, and whether or not we're creating an artificial divide when we talk about digital space versus this room that we're in, this space that we're having this conversation. Because I think we wouldn't argue that the people who are participating online via the hashtag right now aren't participating in this activity, but we would say they're only participating digitally, but that doesn't entirely feel right. It feels like it is denigrating contributions and basically creating an artificial divide.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if maybe we shouldn't, when we start thinking about the digital ethics of all of these things, do some of what you talked about, what Sarah talked about not thinking about it platform independently, but thinking about how are our lives integrated into the digital, how is the digital important to us, and how do our general ethics interplay with that? What are the new ethics that we have to develop to live within a world that is just a part of our world now?
Yeah, and I think you probably find that there's quite a bit of stuff, and you might be looking at it anyway in your PhD in media and communications, studies that would help you to think some of that through. Yeah, I would absolutely buy into that as a way of thinking about some of this. Yeah, and I mean, so hello people on the on the hashtag. But they might be doing all sorts of other things like eating their tea and looking after kids or whatever else. And then there might be people in the room here who are, sitting thinking should be at home eating my tea and looking after the kids and completely not engaged with what's going on in the room. So yeah, it is infinitely complex.
Well, yeah. Sorry, just quickly want to respond to Megan's comment on what makes things problematic. And I think there is a kind of divide between what is sort of publicly disruptive and what is private, because you can't police people's thoughts or whatever, right? Yeah. And to a certain extent, what people do on their phones is part of that kind of private realm. It's up to them. So if there's only a few people playing this game as they go around, you can't force them to stop or force them to treat a site respectfully. But when you've got so many people playing a game that it becomes noticeable for other visitors, I think that's when it starts being actively disruptive, and that's when they have to start policing how many people playing it, and when it becomes really well known as well.
That gets into the idea of what's disruptive.
Exactly.
So is there only one way to experience that site?
Yeah.
Or is going and playing while you're at the site also involving yourself in the process?
But it's kind of, the site will say that they're banned because it is disrespectful for an individual to do. But in fact, you might find that what they're doing is banning it because they're getting other visitors complaining. So, but it's hard to say that you're prioritizing one group of visitors over another group.
And one kind of disrespect over another kind of disrespect.
It's all power. Quite often like the flash of the photos or the silly poses that people will attract to. If someone's just on their phone taking selfies, where is the problem?
This project we're working on at the moment with National Museum Wales is kind of investigating invisibility and in digital heritage a little bit. So we're playing with this idea of the subtle mob. You might have come across this before, not our term, somebody else's term, the subtle mob, as a kind of the opposite of a flash mob. So something that's very quiet and invisible, but happens in a public space. And playfully kind of thinking about silence and invisibility and in heritage work, digital heritage work.
Well, I feel like we could probably talk about this for hours, so we could do that at the pub.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank
so
you.
much
Really
for
interesting.
a fascinating talk. It was wonderful. That's the final talk in our series for the year. So thanks to everyone for joining us. And if you want to catch up on any of the previous lectures, they're all on YouTube. See you at the Eagle and Child if you can join us. It was great. Really.